What if I told you that one woman's forbidden love affair literally changed the course of English history forever? A woman with piercing, dragon-like eyes who captured a king's heart and sparked one of the bloodiest conflicts in medieval Europe. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, and her story is so incredible that Hollywood turned it into a hit series called The White Queen. But here's the thing that's been keeping me up at night. How much of what we saw on our screens actually happened, and how much was just pure Hollywood drama designed to keep us binge-watching? I've spent months diving deep into historical records, dusty archives, and scholarly research to separate the jaw-dropping truth from the clever fiction. And trust me, what I discovered will shock you just as much as the series did. Some parts are even more scandalous than what they showed us, while other parts, well, let's just say the writers got a little too creative for their own good. So grab your favorite cup of tea, get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey through one of history's most fascinating love stories and the shocking truths they didn't want you to know. When The White Queen first aired, it immediately became the talk of every book club and coffee shop across America. Finally, we had a series that put women at the center of medieval politics, showing us the Wars of the Roses through female eyes. But almost immediately, the criticism started rolling in, and honestly, some of it was pretty harsh. The most common complaints? People were absolutely obsessed with pointing out every tiny historical inaccuracy. They'd freeze-frame scenes to spot modern zippers on medieval dresses, or eagle-eyed viewers would catch glimpses of modern plumbing in castle backgrounds. Some folks even created entire blogs dedicated to cataloging these so-called mistakes. But you know what? I think we're missing the forest for the trees here. I mean, let's be completely honest with ourselves. Would any of us actually want to watch a show where the women looked exactly like they did in the 1450s? Because, trust me, medieval fashion could be absolutely shocking by today's standards. Picture this. It was actually trendy for women to completely shave off their eyebrows and pluck away the front part of their hairline to create these enormous, childlike foreheads. Some historians think this bizarre beauty trend might be partly practical, fewer places for lice to hide. Can you imagine? And don't even get me started on the headwear situation. The authentic medieval headdresses were these towering cone-shaped contraptions called hennons, held in place with wire and draped with yards of fabric. They looked like something out of a fairy tale, but not necessarily a flattering one. Ironically, in Elizabeth Woodville's most famous portrait, she's actually wearing one of these elaborate hennons, but the show's costume designers wisely chose to modernize her look. And speaking of appearances, here's something fascinating about Edward IV, Elizabeth's husband in the series. Historically, he had long, chestnut-colored hair, and apparently chestnut hair was considered the absolute peak of masculine beauty in the 15th century. Who knew, right? But here's what really blew my mind. Edward was absolutely towering for his time period. We're talking about 6 feet 3 inches tall when the average European man was barely scraping 5 feet 4 inches. How do we know this with such precision? Because his remains were actually exhumed and measured in 1789. Talk about historical detective work.
So here's my take. Let's forgive the show for giving us gorgeous actors with perfect teeth and modern beauty standards, and instead focus on what really matters, the incredible historical drama that actually happened. The series covers an absolutely pivotal 21-year period, from 1464 to 1485. And to give credit where it's due, they got a lot of the major historical events surprisingly right. Elizabeth's fateful meeting with Edward, the Earl of Warwick's treacherous plots, the brilliant political maneuvering of Margaret Woodville, these storylines come across with real attention to the spirit and complexity of the time period. But here's where things get tricky, and this is what I really want to talk about today. At a certain point, the show starts treating rumors, gossip, and historical speculation as if they were established facts, and that's where we need to put on our detective hats. Take this dramatic scene, for example. After Edward regains his throne, the series shows him and his brothers personally sneaking into the Tower of London and smothering the deposed King Henry VI with a pillow. Elizabeth just happens to walk in at the worst possible moment and witnesses this brutal murder firsthand. It's absolutely gripping television, but is it history? Well, here's what we actually know. Henry VI did indeed die just one day before Edward's second coronation, on May 21st, 1471. And yes, the timing was incredibly suspicious. Most people at the time absolutely believed that Edward had ordered Henry's death. I mean, the political convenience was just too obvious to ignore. But here's the thing that the show doesn't tell you. No serious historical source suggests that Edward personally smothered Henry with a pillow. The more widely accepted historical account is that Henry was murdered while praying in the Wakefield Tower, but the actual method and perpetrator remain mysteries. For centuries, much of the blame was placed on Richard III, largely thanks to Thomas More's influential biography written during Henry VIII's reign. But let's think about this critically. Moore was writing during the Tudor period, so he wasn't exactly going to paint a flattering portrait of the man who had been the enemy of the king's father. Political bias in historical writing? Shocking, I know. Here is an absolutely fascinating detail that might change everything. In 1910, Henry VI's body was exhumed for examination, and investigators found that his skull was severely fractured. There was even dried blood still clinging to strands of his remaining hair. Unfortunately, early 20th century forensic science wasn't advanced enough to give us all the answers we'd love to have. This is a perfect example of how the show takes historical uncertainty and fills in the gaps with pure drama. It's entertaining, but it's important for us to understand the difference. Now, let's talk about something that had viewers absolutely captivated and critics absolutely frustrated: the heavy use of magical and mystical elements throughout the series. Personally, I have to admit, I kind of loved it. I don't believe in actual magic myself, but it definitely added this incredible atmosphere of mystery and otherworldliness that made the show feel special. But it raises an important question. Was Elizabeth Woodville really considered a witch? This is where Philippa Gregory's creative interpretation has a tiny grain of historical truth buried within it.
In 1469, during a particularly chaotic period when the Earl of Warwick had essentially kidnapped King Edward and was running the kingdom through him, Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta, was formally accused of witchcraft. A man named Thomas Wake claimed he possessed an image of lead made like a man-at-arms about the length of a finger, broken in the middle, and held together with a wire, and that Jacquetta had created it for use in witchcraft and sorcery. He even managed to get a parish priest to support his story, claiming that Jacquetta had fashioned two figures representing the king and queen, supposedly to use as some kind of love spell to ensure Edward would fall in love with and marry her daughter Elizabeth. But here's what's really interesting. The people of London rallied around Jacquetta. The case collapsed pretty quickly because there was simply no real evidence, just accusations and hearsay. It was clearly a political attack designed to undermine the Woodville family's influence. Years later, Richard III tried to resurrect this witchcraft claim as a legal argument that his brother Edward's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid from the beginning. But aside from these two politically motivated moments, there's no serious historical source that treats the Woodville women as actual practitioners of magic. The truth is, accusing women of witchcraft was an incredibly common political tactic. From Joan of Arc to Anne Boleyn, it was often a convenient way to silence any woman who didn't fit societal expectations or who had accumulated too much power and influence. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history, and it says more about the accusers than the accused. So what do you think? Did the magical storylines add an enchanting twist that enhanced your viewing experience? Or did it feel like too much fantasy mixed in with the historical drama? Now it's time for me to defend the reputation of the most unfairly portrayed woman in the entire series, Margaret Beaufort. This series basically turns this fascinating historical figure into a cartoon villain, and I think that's a real shame because the real Margaret was so much more complex and interesting. First of all, the series invents this completely fictional secret romance between Margaret and Jasper Tudor, who was the brother of her first husband. Later episodes even show her smothering Jasper with a pillow in a fit of rage. It's dramatic television, but let me be crystal clear.
There is absolutely no historical evidence to support any of this. Most historians believe their relationship was purely political, built on their shared goal of keeping young Henry Tudor alive and eventually placing him on the English throne. Their alliance made perfect strategic sense, but romance? That appears to be pure Hollywood invention. And here's a detail that shows how little attention the writers paid to basic facts. There was actually a 12-year age gap between Margaret and Jasper, which the series completely ignores. If Henry Tudor is shown as 5 years old in the series, and we know Margaret gave him birth when she was just 13, that would make her 18 at that point. Jasper would have been about 30, yet somehow they're portrayed as being roughly the same age on screen. It's TV logic at its finest. The series also accuses Margaret of plotting against her own half-brother Richard, portraying her as the kind of ruthless woman who would sacrifice family members for political gain. But here's where a little basic fact-checking reveals some serious problems with this storyline.
Margaret's mother, also named Margaret but with the surname Beauchamp, had 9 children from 3 different marriages. So yes, Margaret Beaufort did have half-siblings, but there was no Richard among them. There were 2 Johns and 1 Oliver, each with their own fascinating historical legacies that would make great stories themselves. For example, her elder half-brother, John St. John, was the great-grandfather of Jane Seymour, who became the wife of George Boleyn. Her younger half-brother, John Wells, married Cecily of York, who was the sister of Elizabeth of York. These were significant political connections that shaped the course of English history. Margaret did technically have a stepbrother named Richard, but he was much older, and it wasn't even Richard himself who opposed Edward IV. It was Richard's son who became a political enemy and was subsequently executed. But of course, the show doesn't care about details like chronology or family trees when there's drama to be manufactured. But here's the most outrageous accusation the series makes against Margaret Beaufort: her supposed role in the disappearance and deaths of the princes in the Tower. According to the show's version of events, it's Margaret who pressures the Duke of Buckingham to arrange their murder, driven by her obsessive determination to see her son Henry on the throne. I noticed something interesting when I rewatched those episodes carefully. Anne Neville is also portrayed as having an interest in the boys' deaths. So essentially, the series removes Richard III from the equation entirely and splits the blame between these 2 women. It's a fascinating creative choice, but it flies in the face of most historical scholarship. In reality, most historians who study this period place the responsibility for the prince's fate squarely on male political figures, most commonly Richard III himself, though some alternative theories point to Henry VII or Henry Stafford. The mystery of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's most compelling unsolved cases, and historians continue to debate new theories. For instance, the Missing Princes Project, launched in 2021, suggests that the older prince, Edward V, may have actually survived and lived out his life quietly in rural England under an assumed identity. Interestingly, this is somewhat similar to the version we see in the show, where Elizabeth Woodville, not wanting to put all her hopes in one basket, secretly swaps her second son with another boy and hides the real prince. But again, this is pure speculation, presented as dramatic storyline. The bottom line, if Margaret Beaufort had anything to do with the prince's disappearance, we certainly don't have any credible historical evidence to support it. The show essentially turned her into a religious fanatic willing to commit any crime in pursuit of her goals, with absolutely no historical justification for this character assassination. Let me tell you about another completely fabricated love story that had viewers talking: the supposed romantic relationship between Richard III and his niece Elizabeth of York. The show clearly couldn't resist adding another layer of forbidden attraction and family drama to the mix.
Now, it is historically true that there were rumors circulating at court suggesting Richard might marry his niece after the death of his wife, Anne Neville. But here's the crucial detail the show glosses over. Richard himself publicly denied these rumors on March 30th, 1485, in front of several prominent London officials. This wasn't a private conversation. It was a formal public statement. The historical record shows that Richard was indeed considering remarriage after Anne's death, but not to Elizabeth. He was actually negotiating a potential marriage to Joanna of Portugal, a Portuguese princess who would have brought valuable political alliances. Think about it logically. Marrying Elizabeth would have made absolutely no political sense for Richard. Not only was such close kinship frowned upon in English society, but Richard had also officially declared Elizabeth and all her siblings illegitimate as part of his claim to the throne. Marrying her would have completely contradicted his own political position and essentially undermined his right to rule. As for historical proof of any actual romantic relationship between them, all we have is the fact that Richard once gave Elizabeth a book with his signature. That's literally it. One book. Those intense tent scenes before battle, the longing stares, the unspoken romantic tension, all manufactured for television drama, not based on historical evidence. And speaking of that final battle between Richard III and Henry VIII, the climactic moment that transferred the crown from one dynasty to another, let's just say the show definitely didn't have much of a budget for battle scenes, decent stunt coordination, or, frankly, anyone who understood how to stage a believable medieval conflict. The most glaring issue, the Battle of Bosworth Field, and notice the word field, takes place in a forest. I'm not kidding. They filmed one of English history's most important battles in the woods, apparently because finding an actual field was beyond their production capabilities. In reality, this battle happened on open ground, and it was absolutely crucial to English history. Richard III was actually well prepared for this confrontation, and one of the most critical moments of the real battle was his dramatic cavalry charge straight toward Henry's position. Richard came incredibly close to killing Henry Tudor personally, and if he had succeeded, the entire course of English history would have been completely different. We might never have had the Tudor dynasty at all. But apparently, for this climactic historical moment, the series could only afford about 20 extras running back and forth with swords in what looked more like a Renaissance fair demonstration than an epic medieval battle. It's honestly a shame, because this was one of the most defining moments of the Wars of the Roses, and it deserved a far more powerful and authentic portrayal. So here's my final verdict. The White Queen is actually a really engaging series that succeeds in bringing this fascinating period of history to life, especially when you compare it to its follow-up shows like The White Princess and The Spanish Princess, which took even more creative liberties with historical facts. If you're looking to fall in love with the world of the Wars of the Roses and understand the incredible women who shaped this pivotal period in English history, this show is definitely worth your time. The performances are strong, the political intrigue is compelling, and it does capture the essential spirit of this tumultuous era. Just remember to keep one eye on the screen and the other on, well, at the very least, Wikipedia. A little independent fact-checking never hurts when history meets Hollywood drama. The real stories of these remarkable women are fascinating enough without the added fiction, and understanding the difference only makes the viewing experience richer. What about you? Did the White Queen capture your imagination and leave you hungry to learn more about this incredible period in history? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into historical accuracy as fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps me know that you're enjoying this kind of content. What other historical series or films should we explore together next time? I'm always looking for the next great story to investigate, so let me know what's caught your attention lately. Until next time, keep questioning what you see on screen, keep digging for the truth behind the drama, and remember, sometimes reality is even more incredible than fiction.